2008, I was asked to help organise a seminar for the Prime Minister in London, which became a food summit, and exactly this issue came up. And the image that we had was of you're the President of Tanzania sitting in your office with the window open on the garden, and you're reading the post has arrived, and it's a letter from the President of the World Bank. But these days it might be a letter from Rolano, and it says, under no circumstances stop exports because the Horn of Africa needs this grain. But the window's open, and through the window is coming the smell of tear gas because there's a riot in the streets outside because the price of grain has gone up so much. So it's no good appealing to kind of the morality of presidents, really, to say, please supply the world, but don't worry about losing your job. You have to provide a package which stops them losing their jobs. So there were one or two things we discussed, and I'd love you to comment on those and maybe think of some others. Okay, one is there has to be monetary compensation to countries so they can have a social protection system to protect the consumption of their citizens when prices rise. So that would be one. And you could have a deal, you know, okay, you'll release exports, but we'll make sure there's enough money in the coffers to pay for social protection. Another one is let's suspend biofuel use of maize in the US for 6 months in order to make sure that maize is available to keep the price down in the local market. So short term, maybe you export, but we will make sure the prices come down quickly. And after that, we ran out of ideas. So I think there's a big challenge here for you two and for you three and for IFPRI. Find us a solution which means that presidents don't lose their jobs.
And people don't starve. Yeah. The president will probably get fed. So that does raise a number of questions, and the IMF facility has been there for dealing with price fluctuations for commodity exporting countries, so that is one institutional way of dealing with that. The biofuel mandate hasn't been discussed by many so far, but that clearly brings, insofar as that mandate is fixed, it brings inflexibility in the demand for grains and oilseeds as inputs into biofuels, and that adds to the instability of markets. So not only are they raising the level of price, but they're possibly also increasing the vulnerability, the volatility of those prices. Now that the evidence seems to be coming out that there is less climate change benefit from biofuels than was originally thought, then one wonders whether the political economy of that might change. My fear is that in the US, that farmers have benefited so much from the biofuel policy that they will want to hang on to it, as will, of course, the owners of biofuel plants. Anyway, some comments from the floor? More comments from the floor? Got a couple more minutes. Anybody like to respond to Simon?
I don't know. You okay.
All right, that's granted. I mean, why demand a country follow through on its international obligations when it will cease to exist by doing so? I mean, but I think we can draw a distinction between rioting in the streets, instability, versus, you know, cosmetic politics. It's hard to, before the fact, draw a distinction like that. But after the fact, you sort of see some patterns. Right? Was it really that necessary to prohibit the exports on, you know, just some inklings of some pest infestation, if I may cite the example of Vietnam, and some floods, or in the case of, several series of bad crops in another crop, in the case of India, or was it more like playing to the gallery kind of politics? So I think this is the kind of behavior that international covenants, shall we say, might be invoked to try to at least inhibit a bit. Of course, in the end, we will still have those loopholes for domestic sovereignty. I think that's what we need to invoke for tear gas and rioting in the streets. That's kind of very simplified and caricatured answer, but that's one way of looking at it.
Only to add to that, I think with and it was the question of what we have learned. I think that we learned a lot since the 2007 to 8. There has been a lot of changes, not yet the impact that we would like to have, but for example, there is a lot of evidence now showing what will be the consequences, even within the country, of imposing bans, export barriers, and so on. And there have been several cases in which those have been avoided by silent work, not necessarily public work in the media and so on, that have been trying to change decisions of policymakers to do that and to minimize that to happen. And that's part of the role of, has been the role of the Rapid Response Forum and countries and multilaterals which have been helping to us. So there is learning. Now, something that also is important is information is a public good. And that's, I think, part of the core of the problem. Just to give you an example, when we were in 2008, I think, there was a lot of riots in Mozambique. And I got several calls from the media saying, why food is creating this problem? And you know, you have to respond very quickly to these issues, no? And what was happening in Mozambique had nothing to do with food. It was a problem of exchange rate. It was fixed and it was devaluated. Therefore, the price of oil go up. Everything go up. But that was not related at all with food. Okay. Now, having tools that allow governments to know what is happening in the world is crucial, and they were lacking of those. So, not to sell it, but for example, IFPRI every day publishes a lighting system on excessive volatility. So any country knows that there is a global problem or there is not a global problem that day. And they can make decisions. Because what we learned in the process was that countries were making overnight decisions of purchasing in emergencies, thinking that they were falling into a crisis, which was not the case. So there is a lot of asymmetry of information, and I think there has been work of different agencies to try to reduce, and that's part of the aims. Now, what ideas can be there also to have an institutional mechanism, because what you want. One thing that I have learned, sadly, is that I don't think that any global arrangement will work. We, for example, IFPRI was pushing the concept of virtual reserves, and I am happy ISM+3 has a virtual component. ECO was, the concept at least that was designed, had a virtual component. But we keep silent because just talking about virtual reserve, people got very sensitive about it, and they thought that we wanted to control the world, which was a completely market-oriented mechanism and had nothing to do with all the different stories that people were telling. Even a very high-level president of a multilateral, which I won't mention the name, when they asked him why it's called virtual, he didn't know, and he asked, let's ask IFPRI, and then is when the media understood that IFPRI was the one of the idea behind. But the problem with global coordination, and I think the G20 is one of those mechanisms where everything has to be done by consensus, is that it's complex. You cannot get into consensus in many things. And in the few things that you got into consensus, for example, it took the G20 of Paris until 3 a.m. before the final action plan to make the consensus that humanitarian reserves can be moved across countries by WFP. That was not the role of the G20, it was the role of WTO. So WTO didn't approve it, and there was a huge discussion after that. So it's a complex institutional arrangement that needs to improve, and I think that the G20 starting, the Paris G20 was very active. Mexico tried to bring the private sector, focus on productivity. The Russia G20 was very low in terms of food security, and now the Australia G20 is trying to put effort in bringing it back through the development group. So there is things happening still, and there is still effort to try to improve. But we need to be very careful in the mechanisms and how sustainable and solid the mechanisms are. And what at least we have learned is that the more transparent the trigger or the alert or the thing that will trigger that action is essential. Everybody needs to know how it will happen. That's why now I'm a lot more worried about the issue. but I thought that was because when I was discussing with Peter Timmer about this, basically the being objective in terms of the extreme weather allows you to have a very objective trigger. But that's a little bit the idea. And in biofuels, just to the thing that you mentioned, for example, what happened if we force the US to close the 6 months of biofuels? If we did that in the 2008 or even the 2011, nothing would have happened with the prices. Because at that point in time, because of the mechanisms that were imposed, the US learning the mechanism, okay? Initially, it was, although between quotes, a flexible mandate, but it was really a fixed mandate. And what it did initially, that policy, which is a problematic policy for the world, what it did was transferring the volatility from the oil prices to the commodity prices. No? So whenever the oil price go up, I can move into biofuel, make money. When the oil price go down, I can move into food, and therefore I make money also in the food market. So it increased the volatility because of the concentration of the supply. But then the US changed the policy and created these future type of arrangements that allow me to make it more flexible. And that is smooth effect. So when we have the 211 increases in prices, that was not the problem really. And if you look now, biofuels have started to settle. So policies at the beginning could create problems. Brazil have a very nice policy in biofuels, it's a flexible mandate. Even the cars have this thing that change, and I can decide what type of fuel I use. So we need to be careful, and especially information needs to be very transparent. And in that way, I think AMIS could play a significant role to improve that level of asymmetry of information.
Thanks, Maximo. Tuan, if you got a last 30-second comment?
At the national level for policy with after 2008, I mean, we change a lot in terms of, I mean, also the attitude toward the food price spike. The point that the moment that we apply export restriction, export quota, so it means that at the time of very high price in the world market, but our farmer and enterprises, they cannot export, so they blame the government a lot. So government after that they say no, okay, no more administrative control. We move more to market mechanism. Like first we apply export tax, and then later on we remove the monopolistic power of state-owned enterprises in export, and we try to commercialize the dry export sector. And the third one is that we move from government to government contract to more commercial contract. Like before, government to government contract like is accounted for about 60% of total rice export in Vietnam. Now it reduced to only 20%. So it's the way we handle the issue in Vietnam.
Okay, our time's up. I won't try and sum up now because we get a chance to do that in the next plenary session. But thank you all very much for your participation, and why don't you thank our panellists also.